My name was acclaimed in luxury kitchens, whispered at tables where dishes were not just food, but poetry. I was the chef who transformed ingredients into memories, who cooked not for the stomach, but for the soul. Each recipe was a confession, a secret shared between me and those who tasted it. Now, my only stage is this cold cell, and the only taste I feel is regret. They say I used my gift for evil, that the dish I created to awaken a man's nostalgia was, in fact, his death sentence. The accusation, poisoning, the victim. A food critic whose power could make or break careers with a single word. And he chose to destroy mine. The sound of keys turning in the lock has become the soundtrack to my new life. A metallic sound that echoes the loss of my freedom, my identity. The smell of disinfectant and loneliness permeates the air, a mixture no amount of spices could disguise. In the prison kitchen, a place of dented pots and lifeless ingredients, the other inmates look at me with a mixture of curiosity and contempt. They see me as the dethroned queen, the woman who cooked for the rich and now eats the same dry bread as the rest of us. They don't understand my silence, my refusal to touch any pot. For them, cooking is a chore. For me, it was my soul. And my soul now was locked away. But the hunger inside me has a different voice. It's not just an emptiness in my stomach. It's an echo of the hopelessness we all carry. And as the whispers turned into pleas, and the pleas into pleas, I realized my silence was punishing not only me, but them as well. The need for some warmth, for a taste reminiscent of a lost home, began to break the icy shell that had formed around my heart. Maybe, just maybe, even in this God-forsaken place, a plate of food could be a form of redemption, a small act of faith amidst the chaos. The question was, did I still have the strength to find that faith in myself? The first night in the cell is marked not by darkness, but by the absence of silence. There is a constant hum of suppressed humanity, the muffled crying of a woman on the bottom bunk, the grinding of another's teeth, the whispers that crawl along the walls like insects. The air is thick, heavy with the smell of fear, sweat, and cheap disinfectant, a fragrance that clings to the soul and promises never to leave. I feel the chill of the thin mattress through my rough uniform, a chill that comes not from the temperature, but from complete and utter loneliness. The bars on the small window show no stars, only the yellowish glow of a security post, an artificial moon for a planet of lost souls. What haunts me most, however, is not the noise outside, but the deafening silence within. The chef, the artist, the woman I was, has been silenced. Only a number remains, a shadow waiting for the dawn that would bring not hope, but confirmation that this hell is now my home. The clang of keys in the hallway at 5 a.m. is the veritable alarm clock from hell. It doesn't wake you gently. It rips you from any semblance of peace sleep once offered. The count is a ritual of dehumanization. We stand, blank-faced, while the guards inspect us like cattle. My cellmate, an older woman with eyes that have seen too much tragedy, nudges me. "Keep your head down, rookie. Don't look anyone in the eye. Looking here is a weapon, and you don't know how to shoot it yet." I follow her advice, my feet dragging toward the cafeteria, the epicenter of chaos. The food line is a silent battlefield, where hierarchy is defined by looks and postures. I pick up my metal tray, and the food tastes like my failure. Colorless, textureless, soulless. It's just fuel to keep the body functioning, nothing more. As I return to my cell, the weight of reality crushes me. This isn't a nightmare I'll wake up from. Every detail, from the stinging uniform to the chalky toothpaste, is real. The loss of freedom is abstract until you feel it. It's the inability to open a window, to choose what to eat, to walk in silence under the moon. I reflect on the devastating irony. I, who dedicated my life to creating sublime sensory experiences, am now confined to a world where every sense is assaulted. Justice has taken away my future, but prison is robbing me of my past, staining every happy memory with the filth of this place. The true punishment isn't the bars. It's the slow, methodical erasure of who you once were. And worst of all is knowing that the kitchen, my sanctuary, exists just a few feet away. but now it represents the embodiment of my crime and my shame. The days blend into a gray monotony, a repetition of counting, tasteless meals, and empty hours. Time in prison doesn't pass. It leaks, oozing slowly like a wound that won't heal. I get a job in the laundry, a place of hot steam and the smell of bleach, where the hum of the machines drowns out the sound of my thoughts. It's manual labor, repetitive, and I cling to it like a lifeline, but it's impossible to escape my past. During lunch, sitting in the corner of the cafeteria, I hear the whispers. It's her, the chef, the one who cooked a man to death. Each word is a tiny needle piercing the armor I try to build around myself. The prison kitchen, with its dented aluminum pots and the smell of rancid grease, becomes the stage for my daily judgment. The other inmates watch me, waiting for me to approach the stove. Perhaps out of curiosity, perhaps out of malice. One afternoon, the leader of one of the trolleys, a woman named Sonia, corners me near the laundry tubs. Her eyes are hard, fixed on me. I hear you have magic hands in the kitchen. The girls are tired of all this washing. Why don't you do something useful and cook for us? Her voice is low, but filled with a veiled threat. I don't cook anymore, I reply, my voice shakier than I'd like. She laughs, a dry, joyless sound. In here, everyone does what needs to be done. You're not special. Do you think you're better than us because you served rich people food? Humiliation burns my face. In that moment, I understand that my refusal isn't seen as personal grief, but as an act of arrogance. Staying away from the stove has become a silent battle, a way of preserving the only part of me they haven't yet touched. But the pressure increases every day, and the silence of my pans resounds like a challenge. Loneliness becomes my only companion. I isolate myself, avoiding the stares, the taunts, the weight of expectations. My refusal to cook, which began as a form of self-preservation, is turning me into an outcast. The irony is cruel. The same gift that connected me to thousands of people now isolates me on an island of resentment. The other inmates don't see my pain. They see only the lost privilege, the queen who refuses to soil herself among the common people. I begin to wonder if I'm protecting my soul or just punishing myself further. What remains of an artist when they refuse to create? I'm just a broken woman, haunted by the ghosts of time and rosemary, and a new question begins to form in my mind, more frightening than any threat from Sonia. What if, by abandoning the kitchen, I've abandoned myself? Winter arrived without warning, bringing a chill that seemed to emanate from the concrete walls themselves. With it came a wave of illness, a dry cough that echoed through the corridors like an omen. My cellmate, the older woman who had counseled me that first night, named Elena, was among the hardest hit. She could barely stand, her body trembling beneath the thin blanket, and she refused the bland food in the cafeteria. Her eyes, once filled with weary wisdom, were now clouded with fever and resignation. Seeing her waste away awakened something in me, a pang of compassion that pierced the fog of my own misery. Her hunger wasn't just physical. It was a hunger for care, for a small gesture of humanity in a place striving to annihilate her. That night, as she slept fitfully, the image of a simple soup, the one my grandmother made when I was sick, invaded my thoughts with painful clarity. The next day, I did something I swore I'd never do again. During work, I detoured to the kitchen. The place was chaotic and noisy, but for the first time, I saw it not as a monument to my crime, but as a place of possibility. With trembling hands, I grabbed a potato, a carrot, and an onion left over from lunch. I hid the vegetables in my uniform and took them to the laundry room. Using an empty metal can and the water heater we used for our clothes, I improvised a stove. I chopped the vegetables with a sharp metal lid. The process was clumsy, primitive, but strangely familiar. The smell of sautéing onions, even without oil, filled the small space and, for a moment, transported me far from the bars and despair. It wasn't haute cuisine. It was an act of survival, an act of faith. When the improvised soup was ready, a thin but warm and fragrant broth, I brought it to Elena. Her eyes widened in surprise as she caught the aroma. "What's this?" she whispered. "Just a little medicine," I replied. She took the first sip, and a sigh escaped her lips. A tear ran down her wrinkled face. It tastes like home. In that moment, something inside me shattered and rebuilt itself. That small gesture, born of necessity and compassion, reminded me of the true power of food. It wasn't about awards, critics, or status. It was about nourishment, healing, connection. By feeding Elena's hunger, I had unwittingly begun feeding my own starving soul. The silence of my pots had been broken, not with a crash, but with the whisper of soup warming a cold cell. And that small glimmer of light was enough to make me question, what else could I do? The story of Elena's soup spread through the pavilion like a whispered secret. The hostility surrounding me began to dissipate, replaced by a cautious curiosity. The looks were no longer just contempt. Now they held a new question, a glimmer of hope. The kitchen, that place I had seen as the tomb of my career, began to change shape in my mind. Perhaps it wasn't a tomb, but a cocoon, a place where something could be transformed. Even amidst decay, Sonia and her group watched me from a distance, their faces unreadable. They no longer threatened me directly. Instead, they waited, measuring my worth, my usefulness. The air around the stove was charged with a different tension, no longer of revulsion, but of expectation. It was neutral territory, a power vacuum, and I realized it could be mine. I decided to take a gamble. I sought out the head guard, a stern woman named Mrs. Davis, and made a proposal. I offered to take over meal planning for our cellar in exchange for access to some extra basic ingredients from the storeroom. Nothing fancy, just dried herbs, more vegetables, maybe a different kind of grain. Food here is for sustenance, not pleasure, she said. Her eyes narrowed. Morale is low, violence is high. A plate of decent food can be more effective than a baton in maintaining order, I countered, my old chef's confidence briefly resurfacing. To my surprise, she nodded. My first official act was to make a simple but rich stew. The challenge was monumental, transforming low-grade meat and wilted vegetables into something comforting. The act of chopping, sautéing, and seasoning absorbed me completely. The chaos of the prison disappeared, and only the calming rhythm of my hands, the alchemy of flavors remained. For the first time in months, I wasn't a prisoner. I was a cook. The result was transformative. That night, the cafeteria was nearly silent. The women ate slowly, savoring every bite. It wasn't my best dish, far from it, but it was honest, warm, and made with intention. It was food, not rations. At the end of the meal, Sonia approached my table. She said nothing, just left a pack of cigarettes, the prison's strongest currency, and walked away. It was a sign of respect, a peace treaty. That night, in my cell, I realized I had found a refuge. The kitchen was the only place where I had control, where the rules of the outside world didn't apply. I wasn't cooking for fame or glory, but for sanity, for order. And this new way of cooking, stripped of all ego, felt purer, more real. But I knew this piece was fragile. By becoming valuable, I also became a piece in the prison's complex power game. And in such a game, pawns are easily sacrificed. Over time, the kitchen solidified itself as my domain. I had a routine, a purpose. The four walls of that hot, noisy space became the center of the cell block's social life. The prison families, small groups of women united by protection, history, or necessity, began approaching me, not with threats, but with requests. A plate of home-cooked food became a bargaining chip, a status symbol, a message. A request wasn't just about taste. It was a test of loyalty, a plea for help, a silent confession. An older woman asked me to make cornbread her mother had made in Mississippi. Another, a frightened young woman, wanted the macaroni and cheese she'd eaten as a child. The kitchen became my confessional, and I, the unlikely priestess who listened to the stories of broken lives through lists of ingredients. On a gray October afternoon, one of the youngest inmates, Maria, came to me, her eyes red from crying. It was her son's 5th birthday, a boy she hadn't seen since her arrest. "I just wanted him to have a cake," she sobbed. "Just a little piece of cake." The request was impossible, We had no oven, no flour, no fresh eggs, no refined sugar. But the desperation in her voice struck me viscerally, evoking my own loss. That absurd challenge became a personal mission. I spent the next 2 days negotiating. I traded extra stew for packages of commissary cookies, some coffee for powdered milk, a future favor for a smuggled chocolate bar. I recruited other women. One crushed the cookies into a coarse flour, another helped me melt the chocolate over the laundry room water heater. We used peanut butter and powdered milk to create a filling and decorated it with pieces of an apple I'd saved from lunch. The result was a misshapen creation, a sad imitation of a birthday cake, but it was made with the collective effort of a dozen women. When I handed it to Maria, she burst into tears, hugging that small offering as if it were the most precious thing in the world. That night, she shared the cake with her family, and for a few minutes, the sound of laughter replaced the whispers of despair. That act of collective creation taught me about the solidarity that can blossom in the darkest places. We were all hungry, not just for food, but for purpose, for dignity. Yet, as I recreated Maria's memory, my own memories began to bubble dangerously close to the surface. Each dish I made for them was a closed door to my own past. The question was, how much longer could I keep that door locked before it was broken down? The routine in the kitchen had become a shield. The clang of pots, the heat of the stove, and the focus required to transform almost nothing into something edible kept my demons at bay. I was in a precarious balance, cooking for the present so I wouldn't have to face the past. Until one morning, unloading a box of supplies, I caught a familiar scent. Hidden beneath a mound of potatoes was a bunch of fresh basil, likely a delivery error. That scent, green, spicy, sweet, hit me like a punch in the gut. It instantly transported me to my old kitchen, to the gleam of copper, the cool marble, and the sound of my team working in perfect harmony. The scent was the soul of one of my most famous dishes, the risotto that put me on the map, and the scent was the last thing I felt before my life fell apart. I tried to ignore it. I'd stashed the basil in the back of the fridge, but its scent seemed to permeate the entire space. My hands trembled. My mind, which I'd kept so carefully occupied with the needs of others, was now ablaze with unwanted memories. I remembered him, the critic, sitting at my restaurant table. I remembered his condescending smile, the way he swirled the food around on his plate as if interrogating it. I remembered his devastating review, which called my food technically perfect, but soulless. Those words haunted me for months, fueling a rage and obsession that culminated on that fateful night. Without realizing it, my hands began to move of their own accord, reaching for rice, onions, the thin broth we had. I was recreating the dish, not by choice, but by a visceral compulsion. The process was torture. Each stir of the pan brought forth a new layer of memory. The sound of rice sizzling echoed his words. The aroma of the broth mingled with the memory of his contemptuous look. When it was finally ready, I tasted it. The flavor was a pale shadow of the original, watery, lacking the depth of real Parmesan cheese or white wine. It was a phantom dish, and as I tasted it, I felt the bitter taste of my own wounded pride. For the first time since my arrest, I wasn't just remembering my crime. I was reliving the emotion that preceded it. The anger, the humiliation, the need to prove him wrong. And with this wave of emotions came a cold, terrifying doubt that settled in the back of my mind. I had always accepted the prosecution's narrative, the story of a poisoning. But what if that wasn't the story? What if the truth lay hidden not in the poison, but in the recipe itself? The door to my past hadn't just been opened. It had been ripped off its hinges. The success of my makeshift kitchen did not go unnoticed. The fights in the cell block subsided, and a thin, almost imperceptible layer of calm settled over the daily chaos. One day, I was called into Mrs. Davis's office. The environment was the opposite of my kitchen. Silent, sterile, smelling of paper and power. I sat in the hard chair before her metal desk, feeling like a defendant again, awaiting sentencing. She watched me for a long moment, her eyes assessing every inch of me. "Your work has had a pacifying effect," she admitted reluctantly. Thanksgiving is coming up. It's usually the hardest day of the year in here. Fights, depression, suicide attempts. I want you to cook Thanksgiving dinner for the entire complex, not just your cell block, for all 400 inmates. The magnitude of the proposal left me breathless. It was a logistical challenge, a test of skill. But more than that, it was a test of faith. I accepted, driven by an impulse I barely understood. The prison kitchen, once my personal refuge, became a campaign headquarters. Mrs. Davis did her part, providing me with access to ingredients I hadn't seen in years. Frozen turkeys, bags of potatoes, cans of pumpkin, and even some rare spices like cinnamon and nutmeg. I spent sleepless nights scribbling menus on napkins, adapting my old recipes to an industrial scale and with ingredients of dubious quality. I formed a team, an unlikely army of women convicted of crimes ranging from petty theft to murder. Sonia, with her talent for intimidation, became my de facto head chef, keeping order with a stern look. I taught one young woman how to peel potatoes without wasting the pulp, another how to make a pie crust with biscuits and margarine. In those days, the prison hierarchy dissolved, replaced by the kitchen hierarchy. We were cooks, united by a common purpose. The pressure was immense, but unlike anything I had ever felt, there were no critics to impress, no stars to win. There was only hunger, the physical and emotional hunger of 400 women who had lost everything. I found myself laughing with my team, sharing stories as we stirred giant pots of sauce. For brief moments, we forgot where we were. We were simply cooking, one of humanity's oldest and most fundamental acts. I reflected on the profound irony of preparing a feast of gratitude in a place defined by absence and regret. The success or failure of this dinner would not be measured by the perfection of the dishes, but by the ability to create a single moment of grace in a place devoid of it. The weight of this collective hope was more overwhelming than any criticism I had ever received. On Thanksgiving Day, a transformation took place in the dining hall. The metal tables were covered with paper tablecloths, and on each sat a paper cup filled with a dandelion picked from a crack in the courtyard. The air smelled not of disinfectant, but of roast turkey, sage, and cinnamon. An expectant stillness hung over the room, an emotion so rare in this place it felt almost sacred. The women filed in, not with their usual hostility, but with a quiet reverence. Their faces, usually masks of hardness or despair, showed a vulnerability that broke the heart. For many, this would be the first warm, thoughtful meal in years, a distant echo of a life they might never have again. It was a feast for broken souls, and I felt the weight of each of them on my shoulders. As my team and I began serving, the silence deepened. Plate after plate, we delivered succulent turkey, creamy mashed potatoes, bread and herb stuffing, and a pumpkin pie made with more love than skill. And then, the soft sound of silverware on plastic plates filled the room. The women ate slowly, their eyes closed, as if trying to memorize each flavor. I saw Elena, my first customer, holding the hand of a young woman who was crying silently into her plate. I saw Sonia sitting upright, eating with fierce dignity. Mrs. Davis passed through the dining room, her face impassive, but when our eyes met, she gave a barely perceptible nod. I didn't eat anything. I stood, leaning against the kitchen wall, and just watched. I watched the food do what it always did best: bring people together, offer comfort, and create a space for communion. In the days that followed, gratitude came in quiet waves. A nod in the hallway, an extra bar of soap left on my bed, a whispered, "Thank you," during the countdown. No standing ovation, no applause, just small, genuine acts of recognition, and this was more rewarding than any positive review I'd ever received. I realized I'd spent my entire career cooking for my ego, seeking validation from a small, elite circle. Here, stripped of everything, I had discovered the true purpose of my gift. It wasn't about impressing, but about serving. It was about the humility of nurturing another human being. In that moment, I felt a peace I hadn't felt in years. A sense that perhaps redemption wasn't about being forgiven by others, but about finding a way to serve, even while chained. Little did I know that this peace would be the calm before the fiercest storm of all. A week later, as the cold normalcy of prison life returned, a guard handed me a letter. The manila envelope bearing the court system seal felt like an object from another planet in my hands. My heart sank. Letters from the outside world were portals to pain, reminders of all I had lost. For a moment I wanted to tear it up, burn it, pretend I had never received it, to preserve the fragile serenity that Thanksgiving dinner had given me. But curiosity, mixed with an ancient fear, overcame me. I sat on my bunk, the sound of the cell fading into a distant hum, and my fingers trembled as I tore the paper. The letter was a portal, yes, but not to the past I knew. It was to a past I never knew existed. The letter was from my public defender, a formal note informing me that my final appeal had been denied, and my case was officially dismissed. For my records, he had enclosed copies of some court documents, papers I'd never had the courage to examine in detail. Most of them were impenetrable legal jargon, but at the end of the packet was a copy of the coroner's toxicology report. My eyes skimmed the columns of technical terms, my stomach churning. I was about to fold the paper when a word in a footnote caught my attention. Anomaly. The report mentioned the presence of a substance in the critic's blood, a rare compound that toxicologists couldn't immediately identify, but which was deemed incidental and unrelated to the cause of death, attributed to a classic alkaloid poison. The poison they claimed I'd used. Anomaly. The word pulsed across the page. To the police, it was a dead end, an irrelevant detail. But to a chef, an anomaly is never irrelevant. An anomaly is the unexpected note that transforms a symphony. It's the secret ingredient. I read the name of the chemical compound, a sequence of letters and numbers that made no sense to me. C27H440. I didn't know what it was, but an electric certainty coursed through me, an intuition so profound it was almost a memory. I knew, with every fiber of my being, that the substance wasn't poison. And what's more, I knew it held the key. The justice system had closed my case. But for me, the investigation was just beginning. The critic's ghost was no longer in my memory. It was on a piece of paper, challenging me to uncover the truth. The letter transformed the chemistry of my existence. Sleep became a luxury I could no longer afford. The word anomaly and the formula C27H440 were burned into my mind. The kitchen, which had become my sanctuary, was now a makeshift laboratory. I scrutinized each ingredient, no longer thinking about flavor, but about chemical potential. Could cilantro mask an alkaloid? Could the acidity of a tomato catalyze a reaction? My cooking, once an act of service, became mechanical. My hands executed the recipes the other inmates expected, but my mind was miles away, in a forensic lab, reliving the autopsy, questioning every conclusion. The women around me noticed the change. The camaraderie we had built was replaced by a worried distance. "You are in another world," Elena told me one day. Her eyes filled with a compassion I didn't feel I deserved. I was, indeed, in another world. A world of doubt and obsession. My search for answers was a battle against the very nature of prison. A system designed to limit, not expand, knowledge. I spent every free minute in the library, a dank room lined with shelves of outdated donated books. I leafed through 1980s encyclopedias and high school biology textbooks, searching for any mention of that formula. I befriended a former nurse serving time for fraud, trading extra dessert for translations of the medical jargon in the coroner's report. She helped me understand that the compound was a type of sterol, a class of organic molecules. It was a start, but it wasn't enough. Frustration was a bitter taste in my mouth. I was chained, trying to solve a molecular puzzle with Stone Age tools. After weeks of dead ends, the truth hit me with the force of a revelation. I was approaching the problem wrong. I wasn't a scientist, nor a detective. I was a chef. The answer wasn't in a book. It was in the interaction of the ingredients. It was in the heat, the acidity, the emulsion. The anomaly wasn't something two added to the plate. It was something that the plate itself created. The thought was as terrifying as it was liberating. It meant that the proof of my innocence, or my guilt, lay not in a hidden vial of poison, but in the soul of my own creation. To find the truth, I would have to go back to the beginning. I would have to face the dish that condemned me. I would have to cook the ghost that haunted my every day. The idea made my blood run cold, but I knew, with a visceral certainty, that it was the only way forward. Making the decision was one thing. Executing it was another. In the days leading up to my experience, the kitchen felt like a stage set for a tragedy. My team sensed the shift in my energy. The air was heavy, thick with my anxiety. I asked Sonia to keep everyone away. "I need space," was all I said. She nodded, asking no questions. I gathered the ingredients, or rather, the shadows of the original ingredients that prison could offer. A pale, tasteless fish fillet, common mushrooms instead of the rare, wild variety I usually used, a withered lemon for a citrusy kick. Each item was a mockery, a reminder of the distance between the artist I was and the prisoner I'd become. Holding the knife to chop the onion was an act of will. My hands trembled, not from fear, but from the weight of memory. I began cooking, and the outside world faded away. My movements were precise, a ballet haunted by muscle memory. Each step of the process was punctuated by vivid flashbacks to that night. The heat of the pan reminded me of the tension in the restaurant air. The sizzle of the fish and the fat echoed my cutting conversation with the critic. I remembered my secret ingredient, the heart of the dish. A rare wild mushroom, harvested myself from a specific forest, known for its complex, almost smoky flavor. It was my signature. In my prison pot, the bland mushrooms simmered, but in my mind, I could smell the rich, earthy aroma of the originals. The final step of the recipe was the most crucial. A drizzle of olive oil infused with Sicilian lemon zest, poured over the hot fish and mushrooms to release a burst of aroma. When I finished, the plate sat there on the stainless steel countertop, a pale imitation, a caricature of my former art. The smell was faint, the appearance disheartening. A wave of despair and ridicule washed over me. What had I been waiting for? A miracle? That a plate of poorly prepared food would deliver the truth that lawyers and investigators had failed to find? I felt foolish, a madwoman playing with food while my life rotted away. The experiment had been a failure. My theory was merely the ravings of a desperate soul. With a gesture of anger and self-loathing, I picked up the plate to throw it in the trash. My search had come to a pathetic end. But then, as the cold light of the fluorescent lamp hit the plate from an angle, something caught my eye. A stain. A small, almost invisible speck of color that shouldn't have been there. I leaned in, my heart pounding wildly. Where lemon juice, my substitute for citrus oil, had pooled on a piece of cooked mushroom, a faint, iridescent blue stain was forming. It was subtle, like an oil slick on water, and within seconds, it began to fade. But I saw it. My eyes, trained for years to detect the slightest color variation in a sauce, the smallest imperfection in a dish, didn't deceive me. That ghostly blue was the anomaly. It was proof that a reaction was taking place, a reaction that didn't belong in a common recipe. It was the silent scream of the ingredients, revealing a secret no one had cared to hear. And then the pieces of the puzzle fell into place in my mind with blinding clarity. It wasn't the poison. It was the combination. It was the combination. The wild mushroom I used, my signature, contained a rare enzyme. The citrus oil, with its specific acidity, the heat of freshly cooked fish. These three elements, in a precise proportion, did not create a poison, but synthesized a new compound, C27H440, a compound harmless to the vast majority of people, but which, for someone with an extremely rare and undiagnosed metabolic condition, a specific molecular allergy, could trigger a fatal anaphylactic reaction, identical in its symptoms to alkaloid poisoning. The murder weapon was not something I added. It was the very essence of my art. I staggered back, my hand covering my mouth. A sound escaped me, something between a laugh and a sob. The irony was so colossal, so perversely poetic, it was almost beautiful. I was condemned by my own genius, by the singularity that set me apart from all other chefs. My signature was my crime. My blessing was my curse. And now, it was my only hope of salvation. I was innocent. The certainty wasn't a hope or a theory. It was a chemical fact, proven on a dirty prison counter with low-grade ingredients. The joy and relief that flooded me were so intense they left me breathless. But this euphoria lasted only a moment, quickly replaced by a cold, terrifying reality. I had the truth, but I was locked in a concrete cage. And the truth, without a voice to tell it, was just another secret condemned to silence. The certainty of my innocence was like a breath of fresh air after years of drowning. But the initial euphoria quickly gave way to a brutal reality. I was a cipher in the system, a condemned murderer without a voice or credibility. The walls of my cell, which had once represented my punishment, now felt like the limits of my own sanity, containing a truth so explosive it threatened to consume me from within. The hopelessness I felt was of a new, crueler kind. It wasn't the resignation of a guilty person, but the agony of an innocent woman chained, screaming in a vacuum. How could I prove a complex biochemical theory from inside a cage, armed only with my word against the weight of a verdict? Justice seemed an insurmountable mountain, and I was at the bottom of the valley, without the tools to climb it. It was then that I realized I was no longer alone. I had spent the last year building something stronger than survival alliances. I had built a community, forged in the heat of the kitchen and cemented by the sharing of bread. I gathered my team, Sonia, Elena, and the former nurse, whose name was Sarah. I told them everything, cold sweat dripping down my forehead as I explained about enzymes, acidity, and chemical reactions. I expected skepticism, maybe even pity. Instead, I found unshakable faith. I always knew it wasn't you, Elena said simply. Sonia, pragmatic as ever, began to hatch a plan. Your lawyer won't listen to you. The prosecution will laugh. We need an outsider, someone hungry for a good story. We used our collective bargaining chips to convince a guard to smuggle a letter. I spent an entire night writing, with Sarah's help for scientific precision and Elena's for emotional clarity. The letter was not to my lawyer, but to a young investigative journalist known for unearthing wrongful convictions. The letter was sent to the outside world like a message in a bottle, cast into an ocean of indifference. The days that followed were the purest form of torture. Every shift change of the guards, every announcement over the public address system, made my heart race. Uncertainty was a slow poison, eroding the hope I had fought so hard to cultivate. I continued cooking, but each dish was a prayer, each meal an act of defiance. My hands were busy, but my soul was on hold. I had placed my fate and the proof of my innocence in the hands of strangers, and my only guarantee was the loyalty of women society had discarded. I reflected on how my quest for personal salvation had become a collective mission, a desperate gamble made by a group of outcasts against the system that crushed them. The question that kept me awake at night was haunting. Would the world heed a truth whispered from within a prison kitchen? The answer came a month later. Just as hope had turned to a cold ash in the pit of my stomach, Mrs. Davis appeared in the kitchen doorway. "You have a visitor." In the lawyer's office, my heart sank. It wasn't my public defender, it was the journalist. The story she'd published was a bombshell. The cuisine signature theory was so unique, so plausible, that it captured the public's imagination. A team of lawyers from a civil rights organization took on my case, pro bono. What followed was a whirlwind of legal proceedings I barely understood. Petitions, new forensic analyses, hearings. Scientists validated my hypothesis. The critic's metabolic condition, though rare, was real. The evidence was irrefutable. I watched it all unfold from my cell, as if watching a movie about someone else's life. The day of my release arrived on an unusually bright spring morning. The sound of my cell lock turning for the last time was strangely anticlimactic. I walked down the familiar corridor, not as a prisoner, but as a ghost. The goodbyes were brief and charged with an emotion too deep for words. Sonia gave me a quick, tight hug. "Don't come back," she said, which was her way of saying, "Be happy." Elena placed a small wooden bird she had carved in my hand. "Don't forget that even in a cage, you learn to use your wings." Stepping through the final gate, and feeling the sun on my face was a sensory assault. The world was too noisy, the colors too vivid. Freedom wasn't the burst of joy I'd imagined. It was a terrifying silence, the emptiness of no longer knowing who I was. I was no longer the celebrity chef, nor the prisoner cook. I was free, but I was lost. Months passed. I found a small apartment in a quiet town where no one knew my name. The kitchen was modest, with an old stove and secondhand pots. For a long time, I hadn't cooked anything complex, just the basics. The act of boiling water, of cutting a vegetable, was a form of meditation, of relearning the language I once spoke so fluently. Prison took years from me, my career, and my reputation, but it gave me a terrible and necessary gift: humility. It taught me that redemption isn't a grand act of absolution, but a series of small gestures of service. The same gift that led me to ruin was the key to my liberation. And finally, I began to understand forgiveness. Forgiving the system, the critic, the world, but most difficult of all, forgiving myself. For my pride, my anger, my blind ambition. Today, when I cook, it's not for others, nor for the memory of what I lost. It's for the woman who survived, the woman who found herself in the most unlikely place. And for the first time, the food tastes like peace. In the end, it wasn't freedom that saved me. It was fire, not the kind that cooks, but the kind that purifies. Inside those walls, between bars and boiling pots, I learned that forgiveness smells like sautéed onions and sounds like a spoon scraping the bottom of a pan. The dish that condemned me also redeemed me, because the same gift that destroyed my life taught me how to rebuild it, one act at a time. Today, every meal I cook is a silent prayer for everything I've lost, and everything I still have the chance to become. Life, after all, is a recipe that only makes sense once we've tasted the bitterness that gives it depth. If this story touched you, share it with someone who believes in second chances. Write in the comments, what part of your life are you ready to start over? Your words might be the missing ingredient in someone else's story. And if you want to keep hearing stories of pain, faith, and redemption, subscribe and stay with me for the next chapter.